fascism? Is it a oligarchy at work? Is it a super heist? Is it something else? All of the above. Help us to get some handle on what it is that we see going on, please.
Well, all of the above is a good way to start, but I would stress that we're in the midst of a counter-revolutionary moment. As you may know, I wrote a book some years ago suggesting that the United States itself, on July 4th, 1776, was created as a result of a counter-revolution against the uh, import of what London was suggesting, the mother country, concerning reluctance in expending blood and treasure so that Native Americans could be pushed back and that land speculators like George Washington could profit. And also, the abolitionist movement was growing in London, and that was threatening the fortunes of enslavers like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, etc. And so they rose up and helped to oust London and create the United States of America. Interestingly enough, there were thousands of enslaved Africans in the 18th century, 1861, at the verge of the Civil War over slavery. There were millions. This theme of counter-revolution also carries forth in terms of the post-Civil War era, that is to say, Reconstruction, where in the early stages, post-1865, you saw a democratic promise of Black folks being elected to Congress, even to the U.S. Senate, believe it or not. But then it was drowned in blood by the Ku Klux Klan and a counter-revolutionary uprising post-1876. And we are in a similar moment today in 2025. And it's important for us to recognize that this moment is hardly coincidental, it's hardly accidental. We should recognize as well that the United States itself has been built upon this concept, barely acknowledged by our friends on the left, of class collaboration. That is to say, this settler colonial enterprise known as the United States of America was built upon unity across class lines between and amongst European settlers. And so when Mr. Trump received 77 million votes on November 5th, 2024, it would be mathematically imprecise that 77 million votes out of a US population of 330 million comes only from the 1%. He had significant support amongst the Euro-American working class, Euro-American middle class, and I'm pleased to see the demonstrations in the streets, the lawsuits, the litigation, the concern, the revulsion. But we must recognize that we have an uphill climb in order to overturn what is happening before our very eyes.
I want to look at two contradictions that immediately come to mind as you're, well, as you're speaking. I'm saying, well, because there's a lot of contradictions in terms of this settler colony, but two contradictions that come to mind. One is squaring up what you're laying out for us in terms of the history of this country, the birth of this country, etc., and this emphasis, particularly folks on the left, in making overtures, right, and trying to make these overtures to moderates and even folks on the right to kind of get it together. This focus on democracy, on U.S. democracy, and how democracy is under attack, and this propping up of this notion of U.S. democracy that now suddenly under this administration twice now is being gutted out. Help us wrestle with that.
Well, you know that in 2024, Vice President Kamala Harris, in her race for the presidency, made significant overtures to that bloc, that constituency that you're detailing. I'm speaking of her campaigning alongside Republican Congresswoman Lynn Cheney, for example. We know how that turned out. Uh, I think that Vice President Kamala Harris would have been better served if she had tried to make an overt appeal to the millions who do not choose to cast a ballot. And in any case, it seemed contradictory to make appeals to Congresswoman Cheney, who in many ways was responsible for the plight the United States finds itself in. She has rarely seen a war that she did not endorse. The Pentagon spending takes money away from human needs, healthcare and education in the first instance. And so I understand the impulse of Vice President Harris, but I think it was fundamentally wrongheaded. I think that for our constituency, we would be better served by trying to lengthen the battlefield. It's important to keep up with the news if you're going to be a true political activist. And as we speak, on the northern border, there has been mass alienation in Canada, mass revulsion at this idea of the United States seeking to annex Canada, turn it into a 51st state, as Mr. Trump has suggested. This is going to have significant consequence going forward. I would hope and imagine that our organizations would be reaching across the northern border, just like I hope and imagine they're reaching across the southern border and reaching across the oceans. Because for those of us who've actually studied the history of how we were able to escape slavery, then Jim Crow, we recognize that it had to be a movement that was international, a movement that was global. And as long as we're stuck within the four corners of the United States of America, it seems to me that we're doomed to failure.
Yeah, that I can see. That I can see. And I want to talk about this international piece because that's obviously a big part of where this administration is going. It's not confused about whether or not this is an international struggle, but also wanting to go a little bit deeper into the conversation around this democracy, right? This idea that there is this functioning democracy here that worked for everybody that suddenly has been crashed through by the Trump administration. That piece is the piece that I think is most or is very concerning to me because it has us wishing for a time to or wishing to go back to something that I feel has been fundamentally broken.
Well, that is for sure. One needs only to wander into a courtroom, a at the halls of injustice, for example, where I'm sure you will be stunned and struck by the disproportionate number of black and brown faces that you see. That is hardly emblematic of a functioning democracy. And I think that going forward, we really must cast aside these illusions. I think part of the problem is that when the fateful decision was made to move away from the egregious aspects of Jim Crow, U.S. apartheid in the 1950s, it took place as a result of the Black community in particular being forced to cast overboard the internationalists amongst us, the late, great Paul Robeson in the first place, in the first instance. And at the same time, we were forced to ingest these liberal bromides, which you just made reference to. The bargain that was struck by the Black leadership led by the NAACP in the 1950s was apparently based on the premise that they could strike a bargain with the liberal wing of the U.S. ruling class. But now we see that the liberal wing of the U.S. ruling class is in jeopardy itself. Many of them are lawyering up. Many of them are wondering if they're going to be subject to criminal indictment. Reference the notion of the so-called Biden crime family, for example. Notice that Mr. Biden, on the way out the White House door, issued pardons for many of his close family members, not to mention others. And so we see that that was an ill-considered bargain that the NAACP leadership made. And it was based upon these liberal conceptions of the history of the United States of America, which obviously do not hold water and are obviously in severe need of repair. And until we cast away these liberal illusions, it's going to be difficult to devise a strategy by which we can extricate ourselves from this deep hole in which we now find ourselves.
You are listening to Conversations on the Way with your host, Nana Gyamf, and I am speaking with Dr. Gerald Horne, talking about this moment where we are right now. looking a little bit, oh, the second contradiction, looking at the second contradiction that you raise, this idea that there is, that there is that the class struggle, that this piece around the billionaires, and talking about the billionaires, that the way that the conversation around them is happening is going to have working class white people, like it's the focus, leave their identity or leave their connection to whiteness or themselves as whiteness to join everyone else. I know this is a conversation that we have generally in on the left, but in terms of, is it race, is it class? And I don't know that there's necessarily a dichotomy, but I do wonder about whether or not the focus on the billionaireness of folks like Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, Zuckerberg, etc., is enough to get these white working class and white impoverished folks to jump into the fray with the rest of us.
Well, let me turn your attention to the U.S. Civil War, 1861 to 1865. Recall that the Confederate States of America, in terms of their rank and file soldiers, many of them were poor and working class Euro Americans who fundamentally were fighting to ensure that slavery would continue, meaning that their labor would be devalued because they were competing with slave labor, which means that their wage level was being driven down, or alternatively, they could be replaced altogether by a member of the unpaid sector of the working class, speaking of enslaved Africans. And that particular bloody episode, recall that 700,000 plus people died during the US Civil War, should remind us that the US, as a settler colony, as noted, was based upon class collaboration rather than this rather artificial dichotomy between race and class, which I think has been found wanting because, after all, what we're referring to as race, we're basically talking about an unpaid sector of the working class. So we're talking about paid sectors of the working class versus unpaid sectors of the working class. That is to say, it's class versus class. In other words, what we should be talking about is class collaboration versus class struggle. And unfortunately, the settler descendants who now populate the working class and middle class have been hamstrung by this idea of class collaboration. As noted, that's how this settler colony started in the first instance. That's the import of the voting patterns on November 5th, 2024. So once again, I think that for those who are truly concerned about transformation, they should learn the lessons of the past, which involved internationalizing the struggle, which involved putting international pressure. It's just like apartheid South Africa. The way apartheid South Africa began to crumble was not necessarily because of the Afrikaners and the folks of European descent overwhelmingly deciding to cast their fate with the African majority. It came because of international pressure put on the regime that forced the regime to negotiate its way out of a crisis. And given the fact that Mr. Trump of late has expressed his solidarity with the European minority in South Africa by freezing aid to South Africa, by threatening to sanction South Africa, that should be a hint that perhaps he too is concerned about international pressure on his regime that will force him and his comrades into uncomfortable compromises. And I dare say that that is the route that we should be pursuing.
Absolutely. 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 Yeah, we'll be talking with Ronald Claude, who is the director of policy and advocacy over at Black Alliance for Just Immigration, about some of what you've just referred to with respect to South Africa and the Afrikaners there and trying to make them refugees and all kinds of stuff. We'll be talking about that later. But you can, yeah, we see the international tentacles. And I want to, before we go to those international tentacles, which we'll talk about, I think, on the other side of our break, I want to talk about a group of people or sector of folks that are not really talked about, hardly at all anymore, in this electoral or political context by the mainstream, which is people who are impoverished, right? People who are not necessarily the worker because they can't get a job, right? Like there's a notion that I think is emerged that people have gone on the left from talking about the middle class. You have some still focused on that, but you have others who have gone into the working class in terms of who they're uplifting and speaking up for, but still not a lot about folks who are straight up impoverished. How do folks who are impoverished, folks who are unhoused, etc., some of whom are working, right, but really talking about it in a class way, how are they fitting into this conversation? How should they be fitting into this conversation as folks are thinking about where we go from here?
Well, as I intimated a moment or two ago, I think that opposition political parties of whatever stripe would be better served if they sought to make aggressive outreach to that sector of the population that you've just described, more so than trying to win over disaffected, alienated Republicans like Lynn Cheney, for example. And in any case, with regard to the unemployed, with regard to the unhoused, I see them as actually members of the working class that perhaps have not been able to find suitable labor. However, I think that they can be appealed to on the basis that suitable labor will be found, will be created so that they can have a living wage, 20, 25, $30 an hour, so that they can have suitable health care, going beyond the limitations of Obamacare, for example, so that their children can receive adequate education, going beyond the limitations, for example, of the presently constructed and constituted Los Angeles Unified School District. I think that that's the more reliable path towards beating back the Trump attack, because I think that these other paths that have been trod, for example, limiting one's appeal to the middle class or even to certain sectors of the working class, they've been found wanting, precisely because of the reasons I've articulated. That is to say, the depth and profundity of class collaboration among settler descendants, which helps to obscure their ability to figure out where their true class interests lie, where their true real and material interests lie. And that is not something that's accidental. It's something that's baked into the cake. It's something that has deep historical roots that will not necessarily be overturned in one electoral cycle.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for that. Because I'm trying to figure out, okay, how are we fitting that conversation in? And I love the looking at folks as part of the working class still, even if they are not actually part of the employed population. And sometimes they are, as I indicated, often they are. You can be employed and have 3 jobs and still live below the poverty level in this country. We're going to go to a quick break. We are in Fund Drive, and we're going to go to a quick break. And then when we come back, Dr. Horne, I want to talk about the international side of this that we know we need to pull in. Off to a quick break.
Eight 818-985-5735 is the number to call for Conversations on the Way. Conversations with Gerald Horne. Conversations about immigration, civil rights, democracy, life. Conversations on the Way, a very important show to KPFK with attorney Nana Gyamf, a strong woman making a difference. This is what KPFK is all about, walking the walk and talking the talk. Black history, We're talking about Black History Month. Trump doesn't want you to know pack that we're offering for $150. So it's a Black History jump drive. And this features the likes of the Black Panther movement. You hear Bobby Seale and Huey Newton, Catherine Cleaver, Elaine Brown, trials and tribulations of the Black Panthers, the raids in the Oakland and Los Angeles Black Panther communities, and also we got to talk about this pack also features The Souls of Black Folk, parts 1 and 2, Dick Gregory, also Redefining Black Power in the Age of Obama, parts 1, 2, and 3, Nelson Mandela, The Noblest Son of Africa, parts 1 and 2, Collected Speeches of Fannie Lou Hamer, $150 donation, 818-985-5735. You also get June Jordan, the voice, the poet, the activist, the essayist, the teacher, June Jordan. That's an hour talk. The Coltrane Legacy, 59 minutes. Sun Ra, Sojourner Truth, Being a Sign Unto the People. That's an hour show. Lady Day, documentary, Billie Holiday, Maya Angelou, 59 minutes. The Mississippi Freedom Summer, 1964, 50th anniversary. You also get the Ku Klux Klan, Race and Prejudice in America. That's an hour. So all these talks, all these documentaries are all an hour. But this one in particular, Nana, is one of my favorites. This features Malcolm X, many speeches by Malcolm. You also get the full collection of the Black Panther movement. You get a large collection, pretty much the KPFK PRA library. And then on this, you get Jimi Hendrix, a 6-hour documentary on Jimi Hendrix on one USB drive. That's a $150 pledge to KPFK. So, folks, go to your phones right now at 818-985-5735, KPFK, in our Winter Fund Drive. Conversations on the Way has a goal, and it's a $1,000 goal. We can get there with your help. We are listener sponsored. Yeah, I know. What a concept, right? No commercials, no ads, no corporate interests, no outside influences that censor us. 818-985-5735 is the number to call, 818-985-KPFK. And now back to the show, Conversations on the Way with Nana Gyamf.
Thank you so very much, Gary. Folks, please call in and make sure that you donate right now. You know, I've been saying it, and I'm not joking when I say it. There are not that many places where we can have these kinds of conversations. KPFK is, a rarity. And it is not, look at who is about to get who has gotten their grubby little hands on the administration, which includes, right, looking at how we transmit information, how we communicate, what we're able to communicate. And, as I've said to you all before, that 35 hours on that jump drive, hey, these people are going to the Library of Congress and start taking stuff off the shelves. We've got to make sure that we all have that. It's time to be collective and community about the education that we have if we weren't doing so before. So please pledge your $150, our appreciation gift, the Black History Month Jump Drive. Call today, 818-985-5735. Dr. Horne, let's talk about this international piece. Clearly, I don't think it's an accident that when Trump was coming in, he came in a-blazing on international pieces. I'm taking over the Panama Canal. I'm taking over Greenland. Canada's going to be the 51st state. I'm shaking hands with the fascists in Italy. I am, all the things to make it clear. In fact, in his speech, he talked about expanding the territory of the United States. So he clearly has an internationalist perspective. Talk, if you will, please, a little bit about that and how that connects to this need that we have to really look and operate in an internationalist way.
Well, this is what I mean about casting aside liberal illusions. Liberal illusions, of course, including the concept that post-1776, this so-called liberal democracy was created, sweeping under the rug the uprooting of the indigenous, the increase in the number of enslaved Africans, the war against Mexico in the mid part of the 19th century, which brings into the United States, not least what is now the state of California, the overthrow of the Hawaii Kingdom, 1893, which then leads to Hawaii become presumably the 50th and final state in 1959. But with the ascension of Mr. Trump, it seems to me that we should be casting aside those illusions, because he's made clear that the land grabs of the 19th century are just a prelude to the land grabs of the 21st century. However, what we also need to realize is that Mr. Trump has unveiled once again the nature of settler colonialism in terms of trying to rescue the so-called Africana settlers in South Africa by offering them refuge in the United States. We already know that he's surrounded by those who fled post-apartheid South Africa, including Elon Musk, including David Sachs, the AI and crypto czar in the White House, including Roelof Botha, a name that should ring a bell since he's probably the leading venture capitalist in Silicon Valley, Joe Pollock, who has been mentioned as a possible U.S. ambassador to South Africa, his former homeland. And of course, we also recognize the import of settler colonialism when Mr. Trump threatens to do the dirty work of settler colonial Israel by engaging in ethnic cleansing in Gaza with the Pentagon, with the U.S. military at the tip of the spear. Mr. Trump is exemplifying that he sees settler solidarity as crucial and critical to his reign. In other words, as your comment at the top suggested, he is getting and gaining altitude from international relationships, whereas our movement, not least because of the bargain that was struck in the 1950s that we would cast aside our internationalists led by Paul Robeson in return for domestic concessions, we're fighting with one arm tied behind our back. Where are the opposition movements in the United States that are seeking to rally support for our cause internationally? Even as I noted, Canada as a nation has turned against the United States of America because of this loose talk about annexing this gigantic neighbor to the north, a follow-on to the War of 1812. The United States actually sought to annex Canada once again, not least because it was providing a sanctuary for fleeing enslaved Africans, for example. So once again, the missing piece in this national conversation of anti-Trumpism is internationalism. And given the fact that Mr. Trump has significant support among settler descendants in the working class and the middle class, it seems to me that that's the only alternative that's left.
Yeah, the alternative it's more than the alternative. It's the actual, it's the thing, right? What we're doing right now is the alternatives, and those alternatives are absolutely not working. Thank you so very much, Dr. Horne, for taking this time with us. How do folks reach you if they want to reach you? Are you followable? How do folks get in touch?
Well, I'm not underground yet. I'm rather easy to reach, as your production staff ascertained when they asked me to be on this program. But in terms of following me, I would say follow my lectures that are proliferating on YouTube as we speak, not to mention proliferating on my Facebook page.
Excellent. Thank you so very much. We really appreciate you. Definitely need to have you join the conversation again. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Good luck to
we
you.
We state these facts only to let you know that those of us who are revolutionary,
folks, if you have missed any part of this hour from 10 this morning for 90 days after that, just go to kpfk.org, scroll down to archives, and click on Conversations on the Way. You'll be able to listen to our show in its entirety. You can also follow me at Attorney Nana on what they called X, and Instagram. Also subscribe to my YouTube channel at Attorney Nana Gyamf. You're listening to Conversations on the Way with me, your host, Nana Gyamf.